Yeah.
Well, Jen, lest it seem like we are riding with Biden too hard, there is a whole bunch of malarkey coming out of the Biden administration in the realm of foreign policy. And that's what's going to be my decode today. The subject will be Cuba, because we saw big news in Cuba this week as Raul Castro, who had been leading the Cuban Communist Party since 2006, announced that he was stepping down.
Raul Castro has announced his resignation as head of Cuba's ruling Communist Party, putting an end to 6 decades of rule in the country by members of the Castro family. Raul, who took over as president from his brother Fidel in 2008, has said he is passing leadership to a new generation.
As for me, my task as first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba ends with the satisfaction of having fulfilled my duty and with confidence in the future of the country.
It's hard to overstate just how important this is. Raul Castro and his much more famous brother Fidel enjoyed an incredible amount of personal prestige and legitimacy in Cuba for their role in overthrowing the tyrannical regime of the dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959 in one of the most remarkable revolutions in the 20th century. The new guy, Miguel Díaz-Canel, won't be able to claim that mantle of legitimacy as he is the first Cuban leader who was not part of the ragtag group of guerrillas who overthrew Batista from their base in the Sierra Maestra.
The country's top position will be now filled by Miguel Díaz-Canel, who has served as Cuba's president for the past 3 years. He is a party loyalist who has advocated reform of the ailing economy without altering Cuba's one-party system.
He has been called the Richard Gere of Cuba by his supporters because, well, you know, he's a pretty handsome fellow, if I do say so myself. But Díaz-Canel takes over as Cuba is in the midst of a very deep economic crisis.
Cubans are living through their most serious economic crisis since the fall of the Soviet Union. This island's been lashed not only by the pandemic, but also by powerful new sanctions that the Trump administration put in place. Improving the economy is the island's main political challenge. But the mood here in Havana is that more than anything any Cuban leader can do, improved economic future, hopes and dreams run through improved relations with the United States.
They run through improved relations with the United States because Cuba's economy shrank by 11% after the Trump administration reversed Obama's policies and reimposed economic sanctions on the island. So really, if you care about the welfare of the Cuban people, you really need to pressure the Biden administration to reverse Trump's policies and go back to his former boss's policy of détente with Cuba. Well, a journalist asked the State Department for the Biden administration's reaction to the news in Cuba, and this is what they got.
What I would say is, of course, it is for the Cuban people to speak to the results of the Cuban Party Congress. We have spoken about our review of our Cuba policy, which remains ongoing. But we know, of course, that will be governed by 2 principles. First, support for democracy and human rights will be at the core of those efforts. And we will seek to empower the Cuban people to determine their own future. And second, Americans, as we've said, tend to be the best ambassadors for freedom in Cuba. Don't have anything to add about the change that has been announced. Again, it's for the Cuban people to speak to the results of their party Congress.
America are the best ambassadors for freedom in Cuba. So there you have it. Instead of words of rapprochement, Biden's State Department is continuing Trump's hawkish position towards Cuba. I think that many liberals and progressives have been surprised by this. Obama's top foreign policy advisor, Ben Rhodes, tweeted that, quote, "So far, Biden has been completely indistinguishable from Trump on Cuba policy and messaging." The Biden administration has not indicated that it wants to lift the economic sanctions that are crippling Cuba. It also hasn't removed Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, a policy that Trump implemented just before he left office.
The Trump administration, certainly the State Department, very busy in these final days. Let's start with Cuba. We now know that it is back on the U.S.'s list of state sponsors of terrorism. Now, this is according to officials at the State Department who say that this decision was made because of Havana's, quote, continued support of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
Now, the question is why? I mean, you would think it would be the easiest thing in the world for Biden to just say, Orange man bad, and I'm going to go back to the good policies of my good friend Barack Obama. Well, for one thing, it looks like Biden and his people are reacting to their poor showing in Florida in last year's presidential election, in which Trump defied the polling and won pretty comfortably.
Florida was a tremendous victory.
Miami-Dade County key to Trump's Florida victory. It's home to a large number of conservative Latinos, unique in the state and country.
The conventional wisdom is that because there's a lot of Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade, Democrats get punished for appearing soft on communism.
To go down as one of the most progressive presidents in American history.
A flood of political ads tying Biden to socialists struck fear in many Miami-Dade Latinos who'd escaped communist regimes in Cuba and Venezuela.
People that, like me, that was born under a socialist regime, we don't want that happening in the United States.
Now, it's worth pointing out that Obama won Florida, including Miami-Dade, 2 times, despite his softness towards the Castros. So let's just say that the conventional wisdom may not be that wise. But the other major factor is the presence of one Bob Menendez at the top of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Menendez is a Cuban-American senator from New Jersey who miraculously survived a pretty serious corruption case to win re-election. And according to Politico, this headline reads, "The road to Joe Biden's foreign policy runs through Bob Menendez." In the lead, in the article, it writes, "If Biden thinks he can make foreign policy decisions without consulting New Jersey's Robert Menendez, he's got another thing coming. And Bob Menendez did not like Obama's policy towards Cuba.
Reaction from the highest-ranking Cuban-American elected official in the country and political thorn in Obama's side was swift and predictable. Before a dramatic wall of pictures of former Cuban political prisoners, Senator Bob Menendez blasted the administration for today's announcement.
It is totally unacceptable for the President of the United States to reward a dictatorial regime with a historic vista when human rights abuses endure and democracy continues to be shunned."
So Biden is adopting a hawkish policy towards Cuba, and indeed, he is adopting a hawkish policy towards all of Latin America, including Venezuela. Biden's Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has continued the Trump policy of recognizing Juan Guaidó as the rightful leader of Venezuela, and just yesterday tweeted out that he spoke with Ecuador's new right-wing president, Guillermo Lasso, about ways in which the two countries could work together to, quote, restore democracy in Venezuela. Now, what does this have to do with Cuba? Well, a lot. Because of the U.S. embargo, Venezuela is Cuba's main economic partner in the region. In fact, it was Hugo Chavez and his Bolivarian Revolution that helped Cuba get out of the economic crisis that it faced after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As the U.S. waged decades of economic warfare and outright terrorism on Cuba, it relied on the Soviet Union for economic and military support. And when that went away after the Soviet collapse, Cuba went into a deep crisis known as the Special Period that lasted throughout the 90s. That's when you started to see a lot of migrants come to Miami in small rafts. The crisis was, of course, exacerbated by the policies of the United States. According to historian Richard Gott, quote, "Just when Cuba might have benefited from the end of the Cold War and a possible relaxation of the American attitude, the U.S. government tightened the economic screws. Successive presidents were to increase the pressure, seeking to crush Cuba's attempts to achieve economic independence and hoping to overthrow the island's leader. The perceived crisis in revolutionary legitimacy was the staple material of every visiting journalist, yet the predicted outcome failed to materialize. The regime fought back and Castro soldiered on regardless. Years later, in 1998, Time magazine noted his pride at defying world predictions of his imminent demise as satisfying a triumph to him as any that went before. Outside observers had jumped to the conclusion that seemed obvious at the time, but proved profoundly misplaced. They assumed too readily that Cuba would fall like the countries in Eastern Europe. In doing so, they misread the attitude of not just the Cuban leadership, but the Cubans themselves. And Venezuela and Hugo Chavez provided a lifeline for Cuba in their time of need, mostly through cheap oil, which allowed the economy to get back on its feet. And as you well know by now, the U.S. has waged a vicious economic war on Venezuela, which has crippled their economy, and that has had its effects on Cuba. According to Andres Pertierra in Jacobin, quote, In addition to worsening relations with Washington, Cuba has been hit hard by Venezuela's economic collapse. As Reuters noted last year, merchandise trade between the two countries had plummeted by 70% since 2014. Cuba depends on trade with Venezuela in large part because the latter is a major source of cheap oil. While Cuba extracts some of its oil for domestic use, it doesn't produce as much as it needs. Venezuelan oil satisfies Cuban domestic demand, and Caracas allows Cuba to re-export some of the oil at market value, which is an important source of hard currency. So, with the United States leaning as hard as it ever has on Cuba, the outlook for Miguel Díaz-Canel is a difficult one. But there are glimmers of hope. You see, most governments in the world derive their legitimacy from economic growth. This is true whether it's the United States, in which it's understood as conventional wisdom that the main factor in deciding a presidential election is whether the economy is doing well or not. Or in places like China, where the Chinese Communist Party relies on the breakneck economic growth it has achieved in the last 40 years to maintain the support of its people. But in Cuba, that is only partially true. For decades, a huge source of the government's legitimacy, as we mentioned, was Fidel Castro's personal charisma and prestige. That is true. But it also derived its legitimacy on the social services it provided for its people, namely free quality education and healthcare. And on that front, Cuba is truly remarkable. Its response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been nothing short of spectacular. Just look at this chart. Just 547 deaths from COVID. And not just that, it is well on its way to vaccinating its entire population.
Now to the remarkable effort by the small island nation of Cuba to produce its own COVID-19 vaccine. As large and wealthy countries both produce and consume the majority of vaccines around the world, Cuba is working to develop its own solution for its population, with 5 vaccine candidates now in development.
This is the result of decades of investment in public health by the Cuban Communist Party.
Cuba is an isolated island nation, unique amongst its neighbors in Latin America.
Cuba has a long history of investment in health, especially primary health care. It's largely a medical model. They station doctors all over the world for many decades now. And they also have a long history of vaccine development, especially for the childhood vaccines that we all are familiar with: measles, pertussis, tetanus, etc.
And this is not just for the benefit of the Cuban people. Cuba has used its medical innovations as a tool for foreign policy and economic development. Sarah Kozame writes in Jacobin, quote, "Cuba's commitment to international solidarity has also paid off. Cuban medical internationalism is now the island's principal export, bringing in $6.4 billion in 2018. This practice goes back a long way, well before it was a source of national income. In 1960, Cuba dispatched a disaster response brigade to Chile following a devastating earthquake. It then sent doctors to Algeria during the country's independence struggle, and later to North Vietnam and Central Africa. By the end of the 1960s, Cuban medics were working in 12 different countries. Over the decades that followed, Cuba expanded its programs for overseas medical assistance, training tens of thousands of foreign students to become doctors at no charge. In many countries, Cuban doctors helped eliminate diseases like polio, malaria, and dengue, saving thousands of lives. While the U.S. is fighting to protect vaccine patents so that its pharmaceutical companies can profit off of the COVID vaccine, Cuba is working with beleaguered nations like Venezuela and Iran to get their vaccine out. But back to Miguel Díaz-Canel. Not that much is really known about him other than that he's been a dutiful servant for his entire life. Most people assume that he will pursue some policies of economic liberalization in the vein of China or Vietnam. The Spanish newspaper El Mundo dubbed him Cuba's Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader who took over after Mao and led the transition to the hybrid economic model that we see in China today. Now, economic reforms are surely needed, but he should be careful not to threaten the social programs that have delivered major social outcomes for the Cuban people. And for God's sake, Biden needs to change his policy towards Cuba. But given his awful track record so far, that doesn't seem too likely. Jen.
So, Nando, I think that what you've just laid out is actually further evidence that Biden still thinks it's 1970. It's not just on the domestic policy front, but it's still 1970. We just did the expansion of this embargo thing. Biden is just trying to carry out the promise of that.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, it's interesting because, like, as we were talking about, his domestic policies, are surprisingly good. I guess we could say that they're better than we would expect. His foreign policy has been surprisingly bad. I mean, it's just been totally indistinguishable from Trump's, and that's not even like, it's becoming kind of a more mainstream position. It's not just like a left critic position. But like we said, domestically, for his political fortunes, that's probably the right mix, in that no one gives a shit about foreign policy. At least you don't suffer a penalty for being bad on foreign policy, unless you just, as long as you kind of avoid getting a lot of people killed in a war. But you can kill other people, just not
right, exactly.
While pursuing popular economic policies at home. That's probably a winning formula, but it's no less depressing because I mean, just everywhere from Cuba to all over Latin America to Iran and Russia and China, like, he's just pursued like a very surprisingly hawkish foreign policy.
Yeah. So I also want to add, since this is Jacobin, we have to stand Cuba a little bit. You did not mention their lung cancer vaccine, which I think is truly incredible. I feel like this was big news like a few years ago, and a couple of right-wing news outlets came out and they were like, well, it's not really a vaccine. It doesn't actually like do that much. But lo and behold, scientists say that it's pretty effective. I believe U.S. scientists are now working with Cuban scientists to try to develop it further, or at least they were, during the like end of the Obama period, I think. So I actually don't know what happened after, once Trump took office, and now Biden seems to be carrying that through, as you said. And I also want to mention, so Cuba in the 60s, as like I'm sure a lot of people know, had this really amazing literacy campaign where they basically, like, Castro was like, we just need everybody to be able to read. And so they had this vast network where they sent out, teachers, volunteers, just like everybody to go to like the far reaches of rural Cuba and, other underserved areas, and to like expand this program of literacy. Their literacy rate is now 100% basically. And much like the medical, the doctors, they export that to other countries. They export that program to, other nations in the Caribbean. I believe that they helped Haiti do something similar with their literacy program. So Cuba rules.
Well, it's also just like the quintessential example to me of the effect of propaganda here in the United States. We just remember, you mentioned the literacy program, which Bernie Sanders praised in his campaign for president, and like the U.S. media had like an absolute freak out. Jake Tapper was just like, how could you even like say one positive thing about such a murderous dictator? But like, it's just been decades and decades of propaganda. I mean, and you share funny news story, Kale, I don't know if you have it, from Telemundo and NBC News, that talked about the problem of exploding croquetas in Cuba, and just how people it's just like, I mean, it's just like, how is this published in a US news outlet about like that there's this scourge of exploding croquetas inside of Cuba, but like stories like this are commonplace in the U.S. media, and like you mentioned, that these gains of the Cuban Revolution that they often export around the world, like doctors or teachers and things like that. In the U.S. media is usually framed as some sort of spy operation. That they're like these doctors are also like
collecting intel on like
collecting intel wherever they go, and it's just like, man, it's really remarkable just how the media here in the United States falls in line with whatever is the foreign policy goals of the United States, and it's never more clear than with Cuba.
Yeah, that reminds me when Fidel Castro died, a couple years ago, there was obviously this sort of outpouring of media interpretation from the angle that you're describing, where it was like, oh well, like it seems like an evil dictator. There's one less evil dictator on the face of the earth. The one that sticks out in my mind in particular was a BuzzFeed listicle that was. Do you remember this? It was something like,
no.
Oh my God! Like all of these cute Latina grandmas are celebrating the death of an evil dictator, and it was like, oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, there was that clip that went viral of that like show on Netflix of, this Cuban American family going crazy because the boyfriend shows up with a Che Guevara shirt. That was really funny. And it's just like, it's all crazy to me that like the United States has a military base on Cuba called Guantanamo Bay, which they use not just like as a constant threat to Cuba. I mean, imagine having a U.S. military base on your small little island, but also they use to commit heinous human rights abuses by like just extraordinary rendition and keeping people without trial and forever essentially. Like there's no hope for those people to ever get out, let alone get a trial. So it's just the brazen hypocrisy. Just I can't put my mind in that frame of mind. It was like, well, no, that's just fine. What are you talking about?
Right.
Like these things are not inconsistent in my head. So
I actually have another question for you, because so prior to us going live, you mentioned that you are in Miami currently, and you had sort of touched on this in your segment, but is a kind of sympathy for Cuba really such political poison in Miami or in Florida as honestly, as people want to make it out to be?
I think it's definitely overplayed in that the younger generation of Cuban Americans in Miami are not as fanatical about being anti-Castro. The thing though that has happened recently, I mean, like I said, Obama won two elections in Florida, and won big in Miami-Dade, despite all his rhetoric on Cuba, and he said the exact same thing Bernie Sanders said and suffered no political penalty for it. The thing that has changed in recent times has been Venezuela, and the Venezuela thing has kind of recharged the anti-left animus that existed in Miami certainly in the 90s when I was growing up. The Venezuela thing has become the dominant political issue, and they kind of just lump the Cuba thing with Venezuela. Right. But really the Venezuela thing is the driver. I mean, it gets people very, very riled up here. I mean, it's like, it's seen as like this, the most serious political issue by far. And then the Cuba thing just kind of laps itself onto it. But in terms of like, those radio hosts that you always hear about in Miami who are just like constantly ranting about Castro, like I suspect that if that has dwindled dramatically. I mean, very few people remember, there's very few people around who remember the revolution, that they're just, and the younger people just either don't care or like join DSA at this point. So
right. Yeah, I was going to say, because the big story that came out of Florida in 2020, of course, was this whole weird dynamic where Florida went for Trump, but at the same time, like a supermajority passed a $15 minimum wage ballot initiative. Yeah. And I'm not saying that like the $15 minimum wage ballot initiative had like Cuba or had like Fidel's face stamped on it or anything like that. But again, like they tried. Right? Yeah. Didn't they? Yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
They did try, and it didn't work. But no, and the Lincoln Project did a funny thing in which it started comparing Trump to Castro. Like that was like, you don't like Castro, well, Trump is like Castro. How I don't know, but that was the sort of Lincoln Project line of attack in Florida against Trump. But that didn't work either. It's just I mean, Florida is a very weird state in many, many ways. The Democrats here are just some of the worst Democrats you could ever imagine. I mean, there is no kind of there. It's just, I mean, they ran Charlie Crist a couple years ago, and he was a Republican. Like he was literally a Republican, and he just switched parties to run as a Democrat. And it's like you can't do that and ever hope to win. So the Democratic Party brand in Florida is very, very tarnished in many ways. But Yeah, and it's just, I mean, they keep on losing these gimme elections. I mean, they lost to Rick Scott. Like, my God,
Yeah.
he was the most unpopular governor in America, and they still lost the Senate race to him. So
yeah.
Yeah.